Rebbe is going into some detail which are quite challenging for us to focus in and identify in explaining how the ultimate goal is that we should have a sense how Etzim, how the Ein Sof Be'etzim is completely remote from the whole principle of spheres.
Completely?
Huh?
Completely what?
Removed. And he says, surely above the whole principle of spheres as they are in Atzilus, and we discussed a little bit because spheres and Atzilus are capable of being contained in Kelim, which means they can truly be represented outside of themselves. It's a mamash mitzvahs. And then there is spheres above that that not have the mitzvahs of spheres atzilus, but they still have a gather. They have the gather, what's called the definitive principle of what a sphere is. And this, the Rebbe gave certain pointers. That every sphere has its particular gather. Gather, we explained yesterday, means, the word gather means a fence. And the principle of a fence is that it demarcates and separates one area from another area. And the demarcation is for the purpose of recognizing this area, that this area is unique and it's quite different than the other area. This means that gather. So when you say gather, sphere, gather, then there is a gather ha-chochma, gather ha-bina, even though they're all elakus and so forth, oir, there is a gather to bina and chochma. And for example, the gather of chochma is the yin of a nakuda. And the gather of bina is that it is his pashtus, his rachmus. So, within the spheres of Atzilus, this is what we discussed yesterday, attempting to get us a little handle on it. There are this principle that Chochmah is a Nakuda and Bina is his Pashtus. In spheres of Atzilus, spheres of Atzilus, that can be readily identified with, because since that the spheres emanate one from the other, and there's a certain developmental process, therefore it's understandable that it begins from a nakuda, and then the nakuda is further developed and becomes bina and so forth and other spheres. So there the principle of nakuda and his pashtus is readily understandable, because this is the regular process of development. Even in our own experience, the developmental process of anything begins with a general perception, and then you identify various details in it as his pashtus. At a higher level, above Atzilus, where there is no mitzias of spheres, where there is no, it's not a question of spheres, of Eiris B'Kelim, which means it's not a question of how the spheres develop, because there you're talking about just oir, and in oir everything is present, so to speak, from the oil itself, not because one is developed, one sphere reveals another. Still there is inyan from spheres ha-chochma, even though it's a completely different gather. So there we have almost like a contradictory statement in the Maimer, which we kind of didn't point out last night because it wouldn't be possible to definitively explain it. If you go back, I said come back as well. If you go back 4 lines. 4 lines, the line begins coolly. So he says that the Sfiros Shelamayla me'atzilus, the Sfiros that are above Atzilus, Hagam she'einom behagdora, that although they are not behagdora, which means they do not have definitive aspects that is magdil one from the other, of a limit, mekomokoim, yet still einem yetzim in hagdora the Sfiros Atzilus. They are not excluded from the Hagdara of Sfiras Atzilus. So here we're saying in the same line 2 opposite things. Einam b'Hagdara, einam yetzim in Hagdara Sfiras Atzilus. So we didn't point out the obvious contradiction, or seemingly contradiction. But we did explain what this is about. They do not have Hagdara. They do not have a presence that actually demarcates one area from the other, because this is not Sfiras in Kedim. Nevertheless, they're not excluded from the Hagdara the Sfiras Atzilus, which means that the principle of Sfiras the Atzilus are present there too, and that is that the Chochmah is Bechinas Nakuda and Bina is Bechinas Hispashtus. And here's where we explained last night that in Sfiras Atzilus the Nakuda and Hispashtus element is due to, it can be readily understood because it's a process, and the process has this order. It starts from Nakuda and then develops. Above Atzilus, it is not a process. So therefore, the principle of Nakuda and Hispashtus is present, but it has a completely different implication and different message. That's where he says, "Rag shehim b'inyonim acherim." The Nakuda expresses itself in different aspects. B'inyonim acherim. And this we explained also yesterday, at least we attempted to explain it, that there is another aspect that defines Chochmah as a Nakuda and Bina as Hispashtus. Not just from the perspective of the developmental process, but the very principle of what Chochmah stands for and what Bina stands for. Chochmah, principally, at that level, in the true presence of Chochmah, as we say, it's called Borag HaMavrik. It's a spark. What's a spark? Why is it a spark? Because it attempts to bring to cognizance and to reveal something that is above Chochmah, something that is above Seichel. And in order to get a sense of something that's completely above Seichel, it can only be in a Nakuda. Just a little glance, you cannot really grasp it. That's why Chochmah is a Nakuda. Bina, its inyan is to relate to that spark, and therefore this is inyan for Hispashtus. So it's not a question of cause and effect and the developmental Hispashtus. It is defining the very function, the very gather of what Chochmah and Bina is. So even though they are not separate entities, meaning it's not one causing the other, nevertheless they have the principles of Chochmah and Bina of Atzilus from a different perspective, not from the perspective of cause and effect, but from the perspective of what they actually represent. This is what we ended up yesterday. To the extent this is possible to define, at least at our level, that is the limit.
Rabbi, can we say that in the process of creation,
Shmuel, you're taking us away from.
No, but God is saying, okay.
Shmuel, you're taking us away. This is difficult enough. We can't imagine now its classification. After the senior, if you have something to say, please. We're trying to understand very fine principles over here.
So I'm trying to narrow it down.
No, you can't narrow it down.
So I just accept?
Yes.
Like a tape recorder.
Like a tape recorder. The only way to understand this in Torah in general, and this kind of thing, is first you tape it down and then you understand it. Nasev and Ishmael, that's the only way you can understand it. First let it set in. V'gam b'chinas asfiras de'ak, and even the aspect of the spheres of Ak. Ak is called Odom Kadmon. Later on, Rebbe discusses the union of Odom Kadmon in principle, that Kadmon means, what Kadmon means pristine. I don't know how else to translate it. It means something that is of an original presence, not a created presence. Something that represents something on the original status. That's meant Kadmon. The whole big debate in the philosophical world about the world is is the world a Kadmon or a Mechudosh? Meaning to say, but the world always here, or the world just came to be as a novel presence. It's with Kadmon and Mechudosh. Odom Kadmon means that it's not a Mechudosh, which means it was always there. This principle, Odom Kadmon, was always there. So they discuss and see this a lot. How can you, Odom is a creation. Even at the highest level, it's a Dover Mechudosh, not a Kadmon. So that is explained principally that even though it is a Mechudosh, but the Inyan that's Mischadesh there, this is what's going to be discussed later on, is that it expresses that which pre-existed before the Chidush. That's meant to call them Kadmon. So there, if you have spheres in Odom Kadmon, spheres in Odom Kadmon meaning that these are spheres which pre-existed, they're not Mechudesh. So therefore the whole principle of Gilui, of developmental, doesn't exist, as been pointed out. Not even that. But the whole principle of a higher element coming into a lower element also doesn't exist. Because in a Kadmon state, everything is there. Even though it's Odom, this is one of the great difficulties. I mean, difficult in Yonim to understand the Chassidus, but we tackle this when we learn it. We'll come to it again. It represents the initial Gilui from the Ein Sof. This is called Kadmon, and there things are present not by cause and effect at all, and there isn't even a sense that this comes from here, just the principal truth itself. So, and therefore the spheres in Odom Kadmon do not represent not only not the developmental process, but even different sources. Now, it's Chokhmah is rooted in something above Chokhmah. Doesn't exist. So even Bechinas Sfiras the Ak, and yet in Ak we say there is also Sfiras. And this is what we'll try as best we can to identify. Gam Bechinas Sfiras the Ak, even the Bechina of the Sfiras of Ak, Hagam she'einon behagdora klal, that although they are not in the realm of Hagdora at all, not even in the subtle Hagdora of Oiris, as we explained before, that's above Atzilus, where there's no Kelim. Gam loy bibchinas Hagdora mufshetes, not even, that's in the parenthetical insert, in Hagdora mufshetes. Bibchinas Hagdora mufshetes. Again, Hagdora mufshetes is kind of a contradiction in term, because if it is poshut, clearly there is no Hagdora. There's Hagdora, it's not poshut. Yet, we have to be able to identify a concept that's called Hagdora mufshetes.
What does it mean? Mufshet means simple?
Right.
Simple limitation, simple categorization?
Right.
What's so hard to understand about that? So contradictory.
So, the first thing to understand, the first thing that we need to understand when we speak about this, especially we're going Hagdora mufshetes, we have to understand, we have to bear in mind a fundamental principle. In our orientation, all definitive presences, like we always say, a table, a chair, a house, these are all things that we identify them as functional entities. A table is used for this, a chair is used for this, so they have very clear, definitive presences. And we perceive them as such. We perceive them in our normal thinking is that a table originated from that stage where we needed a table. And the chair originated from the stage when we needed a chair. And we always point out that we have to understand, and this is not that difficult for us to really focus in and recognize, that there is an original element of table in the human being before he ever identified it on a practical way. And the same thing with chair and everything else. And to understand it and to point, so to speak, a definitive finger at it, we see that a table is very convenient, a chair is very convenient, and yet, who relates to it? Only human beings. Even those stupid monkeys that they're trying to train and live among human beings, they still don't relate to it. They'll sit at the chair, but it doesn't mean anything to them. To a human being, it means a lot. which tells us, no, this is not just a practical thing. This is a reality. There's a human sense and an oir in it. This is just a minor illustration that we should understand that everything that exists in the entire Seder Ishtalshus, from the highest to the lowest, even to the lowest, a plain pebble, is all representing something very true, something very real. In the Lakus at the highest levels. Even as the famous thing that everybody knows about, Shentov said, that if a leaf turns over from one side to the other in the middle of nowhere, that represents Ayin Eliki. Moreover, what causes it to turn over? Whether it's a little breeze, or because some animal passed by and kicked it, or have the human being pass by and kicked it, that has a significance. Everything has a significance. Everything has a principle of reality in all this. All possibilities are possible because they have a truth. If they didn't have a truth, they couldn't be possible. Therefore, we talk about spheres. And spheres, as we said before, spheres are processes, represent processes of development. Like we have midas, we have koiches, seichel, and midas. And for a person to act, he has to come from the rotzen, and then into seichel, and then into midas, and then into action. Every aspect of that whole process has a truth to it. A truth means that it is rooted at a higher level, rooted at an even higher level, and all the way to the very top. Clearly, it's to be understood that in its root state, it's in a completely different form than it is in its practical state. Just as we can understand that a table in the root of the human spirit, intelligence, is a completely different table than the table that we are sitting by. We point all the time that there is no more than four legs concept in the human spirit. You can say that over there. It's like I get a mufshat. And it's present not because it is present, but because of the spirit of the general spirit, the human spirit. And yet there's a presence. This is where it becomes extremely deep and very fine and subtle, and yet extremely important and significant to be able to relate to whatever degree we can relate to, just to recognize this principle truth. And this is what the Rebbe is saying. We're going to spheres. And spheres the yak. When a sphere is the yak, there is no hagdor. Since we're saying that it's kadmon, kadmon means it never came into being. If there's no came to being, there's no hagdor. Not even Hagdorim Mufshetes, which means an attempt to give us a handle on it, which is not necessarily correct. Just Hagdorim Mufshetes means it is present not because of its own presence, but because of the presence of the source, and therefore it is present because of its truth, not because of its developmental presence. Gorim of Shetis.
Why is the being Kadman, why is there a spirit to Hagdara? I'm not sure I understand that.
Because Because the whole principle of Hagdorah, of distinguishing one thing from another, is a principle that is representing development. In the human being, going back to our thing that we can relate to, we're saying that we can understand the human being can relate to a table and can relate to a chair. Are the chair and the table distinct presences in the human being? You understand what I'm saying?
Just the kind of entity a human being is. That's.
But he can relate to a chair, he can relate to a table. So this is where you're seeing that when you go to a source, there is no distinction. There's no Hagdorah. And yet there are two distinct truths. To take this muscle of the human being to the principle that we're discussing of spheres, at that level, Chochmah, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvur, Tiferes are all at that same level. They are present truths, indistinguishable, and yet they're distinguishable. They're distinct truths. This is within the human being. And the human being is in the Shama Beguf, which means to begin with he is on a functional level. It means that the human being is here to accomplish. That's what we say, he has a name. He's identified to be a presence in the world, not to be a presence in himself. As a presence in the world, the qualities that come through, they have this level where they are indistinguishable.
Even though they're truths.
Oh?
Even though they're truths.
On the contrary, because they are truths. That's right, they are truths. And at that level, then they're distinguishable. And they're present.
So before we said that you have the idea that the Ayin Hagdara, AyinBase and Hagdara, and so before. This year we're talking about the Yetzim and Hagdara. I mean, we can no longer say that the table that exists in the human being is totally incomparable to a table.
That's right, totally. And that's what, because we're going to spheres the Ak, and that's why we made a point. What are we talking about? Spheres the Ak. So what does that mean? Which is still going to be discussed. But one point to remind about Ak is that's Kadmon. Odom Kadmon, which means it's a spheres that are there in a pristine and in an original state. There is no Hagdorah. Hagdorah has to do with expression, with coming, with some kind of process, some kind of statement.
You may think because
a human being, when he's born, we give him a name. Before we give him a name we said means that he is a presence in the world. Before we give him a name, he's also a presence in the world, in a different level, in an original level.
He's like more of a Kadmon before his name.
Even when we give him a name, it's a Kadmon, but then this is before.
This means, I always thought that a human being, if you put him in a dining room, he makes a table. Because this is how a human being is expressed in a dining room. If you make him eat, he makes a fork. But this is saying that no.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. That he will be missing something, but he will not necessarily immediately in seichel identify what he's missing and how to satisfy it.
But what we're saying here is that making a fork has an inyan of fork in the human being. There is a distinction between all the inyanim, all the human inyanim in his soul. There is an element of distinction. It's not just a pashut human.
No, we're saying that there is no Hagdorah Mufshetes.
There's no Hagdorah Mufshetes.
No Hagdorah Mufshetes. That's what we're trying to say. And yet it's present. That's the difficulty to understand. And yet it's present. A table is not a chair. Gentlemen, I overstate my welcome over here. Okay, this is it for this morning. And we are going to go davening. Please, everybody, people who are davening.